The rope was already around Alfred Slater's neck when Esther Whitaker came over the rise at a dead gallop. Her horse lathered white and her skirts hiked up over her knees like she had forgotten, or stopped caring, what the town of Split Rock would say about a woman riding astride. "Stop that wagon!" she screamed, and her voice cracked across the dusty square loud enough to make the crowd turn before Marshal Holly's Bragg could bring his hand down on the horse's rump. Alfred stood on the bed of a borrowed freight wagon beneath the crossbeam of the livery's hay loft, where someone had slung a rope over the beam and called it justice. His hands were bound behind him. His hat was gone, lost somewhere in the scuffle that had dragged him out of the jail an hour before the circuit judge was even due to arrive. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of gentling horses that other men had given up on. And in that moment, with the noose chafing his throat and 40 faces watching him like he was already a dead man, he found he was not thinking about dying. He was thinking that the woman thundering into the square on a blowing horse was the same woman who had refused to sell him coffee on credit 3 weeks ago because she did not know him from Adam. And now, she was the only soul in Nebraska trying to save his life. "Whoa there, Miss Whitaker." Bragg stepped between the wagon and her horse, one hand raised, the tin star on his vest catching the morning sun. He was a heavy man, going soft in the belly but hard in the eyes, and he did not like being interrupted, especially not by a 25-year-old woman who ran a trading post instead of a household. This man was seen fleeing the Pumpkin Creek robbery not 2 days past. Tom Aldi's is in the ground on account of him. "There's no cause for you to come tearing in here like the prairie's on fire." "There is every cause." Esther swung down from the saddle before her horse had fully stopped, and she was already unbuckling the flap of her saddlebag with hands that shook only a little. "I have the proof that he did not do this thing, Marshal, and if you drop that man before I can lay it in front of the whole town, I promise you I will make certain every soul from here to Sydney knows you hanged an innocent man rather than wait 1/2 hour for a woman to ride in with the truth." A murmur went through the crowd. Bragg's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "Half an hour for what? For this." She drew out a pocket watch, tarnished silver, its case dented on one corner, and held it high enough that the sun struck it. This belonged to Tom Aldi's. His mother gave it to him before he ever left Ohio, and there is an inscription on the back that half this town has seen, because he showed it off in the saloon more times than any of you can count. "I dug it out of the ground myself this morning, not 200 yards from the cottonwood at Pumpkin Creek Crossing, buried under a flat stone, exactly where I was told it would be." "Told by who?" Bragg's voice had gone flat and careful. "By a man who watched the robbery happen from the bluff above the crossing. A man who saw 4 riders, not one, and none of them was Alfred Slater, because Alfred Slater's horse throws a shoe worn thin on the left fore, and the tracks at that robbery came from 4 horses shod fresh all around, not 2 weeks past, at the smithy in Cutter's own freight yard." The crowd's murmur rose into something with an edge to it now. Alfred, still standing with the rope loose but not yet lifted from his neck, found himself staring at Esther Whitaker as though he had never truly looked at her before, though he had watched her across the counter of her trading post a dozen times these last months, always brisk, always sharp-tongued, always too busy weighing flour or measuring calico to spare him more than a nod. "And who is this witness?" Bragg demanded, "since I don't see any white man standing behind you." "He is not a white man. His name, in your tongue, is Standing Elk, and he is camped with his family 3 miles east on land your own government swore they could hunt without trouble until the snow comes." Esther's chin lifted. "I translated his words myself, word for word, and I will swear to their accuracy before God and before Judge Cole when he arrives, because I have translated for this town and for his people for 6 years without once putting a false word in either direction. You know that, Marshal. Everyone here knows that." Bragg looked at the watch. He looked at the rope. He looked, finally, at the faces of the men and women crowded around the wagon. farmers and shopkeepers who had come to see a hanging, and were now shifting their weight and glancing sideways at one another. And something in his calculation changed. "Cut him down," he said at last sourly, as though the words cost him blood. "But he stays in my jail until the judge comes through and hears all of this proper. I'll not have it said I let a killer walk free on a woman's say-so." "You will not have it said," Esther answered, already moving toward the wagon, "that you hanged an innocent man on a liar's say-so either, which is a far worse thing to have said of you, Marshal, and you know it." They cut the rope from the beam. Alfred's knees nearly buckled when his boots hit the wagon bed proper, the blood rushing back into limbs that had gone tight with waiting to die, and it was Esther who caught his arm before he could stumble, her fingers closing hard around his forearm through his shirt sleeve. "Easy," she said low, just for him. "I have you." He looked down at her, at the dust on her cheek and the wildness still in her eyes from the ride, and he said the only thing that came to him. "Ma'am, I don't believe we've been introduced proper. Alfred Slater." A laugh escaped her before she could stop it, short and startled, entirely out of place given the rope still swinging above them. "Esther Whitaker. I run the trading post. I know who you are." His voice had gone rough, whether from the rope or from something else he could not have said. "I buy my coffee from you when you'll sell it to me. I remember." She did not let go of his arm as they walked him toward the jailhouse, Bragg's deputies flanking them with more sullenness than menace now that the crowd's mood had shifted. "I am sorry about that incidentally. I did not know you then. You don't know me now." "No," she admitted, and something in her tone made it clear the admission cost her something too. "But I know a lie when I hear one told against a man, Mr. Slater, and Silas Pruitt's account of seeing you flee that robbery was a lie from the first word to the last. I could smell it on him like whiskey." The Split Rock Jail was a single stone room built onto the back of the marshal's office, with one barred window looking out over the corral, where Alfred had spent the better part of a year breaking horses too wild for any other man in 3 counties to touch. He sat now on the edge of the cot, his wrists rubbed raw from the rope that had held them, and watched through the bars as the town slowly drained away from the square outside, still muttering, still uncertain. The taste of a hanging denied them like a meal interrupted. Esther came to the window an hour later alone, carrying a tin cup of coffee that she passed through the bars without a word. Alfred took it with both hands and drank like a man who had forgotten there would be another cup of coffee in his life. "Thank you," he said when he had swallowed enough to trust his voice. "For all of it. I don't know how to properly thank a person for their life." "Don't thank me yet." She glanced over her shoulder toward the marshal's office, then back at him, lowering her voice. "Bragg let you live because I embarrassed him in front of half the town. That is not the same as him wanting you cleared. Judge Cole is 4 days out from Sydney, maybe 5 if the creek's up past the ford, and in that time Bragg will be looking for some way to make Standing Elk's testimony disappear, or mine along with it. You think the marshal's dirty?" "I think," Esther said carefully, "that the men who robbed that stage and killed Tom Aldy's road horses shot at Warren Cutter's freight yard, and Warren Cutter pays Marshal Bragg's salary out of his own pocket twice a year when the town council comes up short. And I think it is a very strange thing that a man was ready to hang you on the word of the town drunk before anyone thought to ask a single question about horseshoes." Alfred set the cup down on the narrow ledge of the window and studied her through the bars. She was not a beautiful woman in the way the dance hall girls in Sydney were beautiful, all paint and lace, but there was something in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her gray eyes that struck him harder than prettiness ever had. She had ridden in on proof of his innocence like it was the most natural thing in the world for a woman to do, and she was standing here now, hours later, still fighting for him with nobody asking her to. "Why?" he asked. "Did you go to all this trouble for a man you'd never spoken more than a dozen words to?" Esther was quiet a moment, long enough that he thought she might not answer at all. "Because I watched this town decide you were guilty before anyone asked what actually happened. The same way this territory has decided 100 times that a man's guilt or innocence can be settled by what he looks like, or where he comes from rather than what the facts say. My father built that trading post on the notion that a person's word ought to be worth exactly what the truth of it is, no more and no less, whether they're white or Lakota or anything between. I have spent 6 years making sure both sides of that counter get the same honest weight on the scale. I was not about to stand by and watch this town hang a man because it was easier than waiting for a judge. That's a fine answer, Alfred said, but I don't entirely believe it's the whole of it. Something flickered across her face, quick as a bird's shadow. It's the whole of it that concerns you, Mr. Slater. Now finish your coffee. I have a trading post to run, and I imagine Standing Elk will want to know his testimony did some good. She left before he could say anything more, and Alfred sat in the dim little cell turning the tin cup over in his hands, thinking that Esther Whitaker had ridden a horse near to death to save a stranger, and had then walked away from him twice as fast as she'd come, as if the saving of him frightened her more than the doing of it ever had. The next morning Bragg came to the cell with a scowl and a set of keys, and informed Alfred, with obvious reluctance, that he was permitted to move about the town under watch until the judge arrived, provided he did not attempt to leave and provided Miss Whitaker was willing to vouch for his whereabouts, since it was her testimony that had stayed the rope in the first place. It was not generosity. Alfred understood that within the hour, when he saw how carefully Bragg's deputy trailed him to the corral behind the stage relay station, and how often riders he did not recognize passed through town on horses that never seemed to need feed or water, only a moment's pause before riding on toward the North Road. He found Esther at the trading post counter that afternoon, measuring dried beans into a sack for a farmer's wife, and he waited near the door, hat in hand, until the woman had gone and the post was empty save for the two of them and the smell of tobacco, leather, and coffee that seemed to live permanently in the timbers of the place. "I need your help," he said without preamble, because there did not seem to be any use in dancing around it. "Not to clear my name before the judge. I mean to find out who really killed that boy, and why, before Bragg or Cutter or whoever is behind this decides, the easiest thing is to make sure neither Standing Elk nor I live long enough to say another word." Esther set down her scoop. "You want to go looking for road agents while under arrest?" "I want to go looking for the truth, and I believe you already have half of it in your head, or you would not have known to ask Standing Elk anything at all. You went looking for him before you ever came to save me, didn't you?" She studied him for a long moment, and he had the sense of being weighed on the same scale she used for her flour and her beans, exact and unsentimental. "I went looking for him because I heard, from a Lakota boy who trades furs here, that his uncle had seen men on the bluff the day of the robbery. I did not know it would be you standing under that rope until I rode into town and saw your face. Would you have ridden as hard if it had been some other man?" "I would have ridden exactly as hard for any man facing a rope on a lie," she said, though the color that rose in her cheeks suggested the honest answer was more complicated than that. "But I will admit, Mr. Slater, that I did not expect to feel quite so relieved to see you standing there breathing when I arrived." It was as much as either of them was willing to say of it that day, but it settled something between them, a kind of understanding that they would work together and see where the working led. They rode out at dawn 2 days later, ostensibly to trade with Standing Elk's camp for winter hides, a legitimate enough errand that Bragg's deputy waved them through without much interest, though Alfred caught the man watching them a beat too long before turning back toward town. The prairie in September was the color of old gold, grass gone dry and rustling under a sky so blue and so wide it made a man feel both free and entirely too visible at once. Alfred rode a rangy bay he had gentled himself from a half-wild stock horse nobody else would touch, and he handled the animal with a light hand and a lower voice than most men used, murmuring to it over rough ground the way some men murmured to women. "You've a gift," Esther observed, watching him coax the bay past a rattling clump of sage that had made her own mare shy sideways. "I've heard the stage company talks about you like you can charm the wild out of any horse in the territory." "Wild isn't the trouble," Alfred said. "Most horses that act up have been hurt or scared by somebody, and once you understand the hurt, the wildness generally settles itself. It's the same as most things, I expect." She glanced at him sideways. "Is that meant to be about horses or about something else?" "Could be both," he admitted, and there was the ghost of a smile in it, and she found herself smiling back before she remembered to stop. Standing Elk's camp sat along a bend of Pumpkin Creek, where cottonwoods grew thick enough to offer shade. A handful of lodges and a scattering of children and dogs that came running out to greet Esther by name, or by the Lakota name they had given her years before. One that Alfred did not catch clearly, but that made her laugh when the children shouted it. Standing Elk himself was a broad-shouldered man near 50, gray threading his braids, and he greeted Esther with the easy warmth of long acquaintance before his gaze slid to Alfred and went carefully neutral. Esther spoke to him in Lakota, quick and fluent, gesturing once toward Alfred, and Standing Elk answered at length, his hands moving as he spoke, sketching shapes in the air that Alfred understood without needing translation to be the shape of riders and hills and a robbery witnessed from a distance. "He says," Esther translated when the older man had finished, "that he saw 4 riders come down off the bluff trail at a run, right after he heard shots. 3 white men on dark horses, one on a paint with a black patch over its left eye, distinctive enough he'd know it again. The 4th man hung back and did the burying near the cottonwood, while the others kept watch. He says the man on the paint horse wore a red neckerchief and had a way of sitting his horse that he recognized, though he did not know a name to put to the face." "A red neckerchief," Alfred repeated. "There's a man rides for Cutter's freight outfit, name of Jake Denny, always wears a red rag around his neck. Never much liked him. Struck me as a man who enjoyed hurting things more than the work required." Esther relayed this to Standing Elk, who nodded slowly, and added something further, his voice dropping lower. "He says," Esther continued, "that 2 days before the robbery he saw this same group of men meeting with a rider from town, a heavyset man on a gray horse, out past the bluff where nobody from Split Rock generally travels. They spoke for some time. He did not go closer for fear of trouble, but he is certain of the gray horse, because it is the same horse he has seen tied outside the marshal's office more times than he can count." The silence that followed felt heavier than the September heat. Alfred looked at Esther, and she looked back at him, and neither of them needed to say Bragg's name aloud for it to hang between them, confirmed now by a witness who had no reason on earth to lie. "That's not proof enough for a judge," Alfred said finally. "A Lakota man's word against a lawman's, even with your translation behind it, won't hold up the way Tom Aldis' watch did. We need something Bragg or Cutter can't explain away." "Then we find Denny's paint horse," Esther said. "Or we find wherever it is Cutter's men keep whatever they've taken from every robbery the last 2 years, because a man like Warren Cutter does not simply spend money he cannot account for. He keeps records. Men like that always do, so they can be sure nobody's cheating them." Standing Elk, listening to this exchange even without understanding every word of English, said something further, and Esther's expression sharpened with new interest as she listened. "He says his nephew, hunting 3 days back, came across a line shack in the Badlands north of the bluff, a place nobody uses for cattle, with fresh wagon tracks leading to it and more horses picketed there than any honest outfit would need. He can take us there, if we're willing to go before the judge arrives, since after that Cutter's men may move whatever's hidden." Alfred looked at the sun, already dropping toward the western hills, and did the arithmetic of distance and daylight that a man who had spent years on the open range did without thinking. "We'd not make it back to Split Rock before dark if we go tonight. Bragg will notice you gone, and it'll go worse for me at the trial if it looks like I ran. Then we go before first light tomorrow," Esther said. "And we tell Bragg I've taken you along to help move trade goods, which is not entirely a lie, since Standing Elk's people do need blankets before the weather turns. We will be back by the following evening, well before Judge Cole is expected." It was, Alfred thought, a reckless plan built on the thinnest of covers, and he found himself agreeing to it anyway, not merely because it was the only path toward the truth, but because some part of him had already decided he trusted this sharp, fearless woman's judgment more than he had trusted anyone's in a long while, and he was not yet ready to examine too closely what that meant. They camped that night at the edge of Standing Elk's grounds, at the older man's insistence, sharing a small fire and a supper of dried venison and hard bread from Esther's saddlebags. The prairie night came down clear and cold, stars crowding the sky in numbers that made a man feel small in a way that was not entirely unpleasant, and for a while neither of them spoke, content to watch the fire eat its way through a length of cottonwood branch. "You never told me," Alfred said eventually, "how you came to speak Lakota so well a man twice your age trusts your word over most white men's." Esther drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them, staring into the flames. "My mother died when I was 6. My father kept the trading post going alone after that, and there were Lakota women who came through, traders' wives mostly, who took a liking to a motherless girl running wild around the counters. They taught me the tongue the way children learn things, without effort, just by being spoken to and answering back. My father encouraged it. He said a trader who could only speak to half his customers was only half a trader, and he was not interested in being half of anything. Sounds like a good man." He was. He died last winter of a fever that took half the county, and left the post to me because there was nobody else, and because he trusted I could run it. Most of Split Rock thought I would sell out within the year and go back east to find a husband. Her mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "I have had 6 offers of marriage since he passed, every one of them more interested in the post than in me. I have turned down every one. I can't imagine why any man would want the post more than the woman running it," Alfred said, quiet and entirely serious, and Esther looked up sharply, caught off guard by the plainness of it. "That's a very forward thing to say to a man's client, Mr. Slater." "I'm not your client tonight," he said. "Tonight I'm just a man sitting by a fire, grateful to be alive, talking to the finest woman he's met in a good long while. I can say what's true even if it's forward." She did not answer that directly, but she did not look away either, and the fire between them burned a while longer before either of them spoke again of anything at all. They set out before dawn with Standing Elk's nephew, a young man named Little Hawk, guiding them north into country that grew steadily rougher, the smooth prairie giving way to broken ground cut by dry washes and outcrops of pale rock, the beginning edges of the Badlands that lay north and east of the Wildcat Hills. It was slow going, and twice Alfred had to dismount and lead the horses by hand across footing too uncertain to ride, murmuring low reassurance to Esther's mare when the animal balked at a narrow ledge above a wash. They found the line shack shortly after midday, tucked into a fold of land where it would have been near invisible from any distance, a low sod-roofed structure with a corral behind it holding 6 horses, among them a paint with a black patch over one eye. "That's the horse," Alfred breathed low, from where they'd left their own mounts tied a 1/4 mile back and crept forward on foot. "Denny's paint." The shack appeared empty, no smoke from the stovepipe, no horses saddled and ready outside, and after watching a long 15 minutes to be certain, they crossed the open ground quickly and let themselves in through a door secured with nothing more than a leather thong looped over a peg. Inside, the shack held little beyond a stove, a table, and a locked strongbox shoved beneath a bunk. Alfred worked the lock loose with a knife blade while Esther kept watch through the single window, and when the lid came up, they found what they had come for and more besides. A ledger, its pages filled with cramped figures and dates, recording what could only be a running account of goods taken from stage robberies and freight thefts stretching back nearly 2 years, alongside a second column of payments, and against a dozen of those dates in a different hand, the initials HB Holly's Bragg, Esther said softly, running her finger down the column. Paid, it looks like, every time a robbery came off clean. And here, she turned the page. Payments to a WC. As well, larger sums quarterly, which I would wager against my whole trading post are payments from Bragg, and from whoever runs this operation up the line to somebody higher still. Warren Cutter is not spending his own money paying road agents. Somebody above him in the stage company is paying him to look the other way, and he's paying Bragg to make certain nobody in Split Rock asks questions. That's more than enough to hang the both of them, Alfred said, already tucking the ledger inside his shirt. We need to get this to Judge Cole. It was at that moment that they heard the horses. Through the window, Esther saw 4 riders coming up the wash at a trot, still some distance off but closing fast, and among them, unmistakable even at this range, a man in a red neckerchief. "Denny," she whispered, "they're coming back." "Then we go now, quiet as we can, and we do not stop until we're clear of this ground," Alfred said, already moving toward the door. "Little Hawk has the horses. If we can reach them before Denny's men crest that rise, we've got a chance." They ran, low and fast across broken ground that seemed determined to turn an ankle with every step, and they had nearly reached the horses when a shout went up behind them, Denny's voice raised in alarm, and then the flat crack of a rifle shot split the afternoon air. Little Hawk had the horses already untied and moving, and Alfred all but threw Esther into her saddle before swinging up onto the bay. And then there was nothing to do but ride, the ground tearing away beneath them as gunfire chased their heels, and the Badlands blurred past in a rush of dust and drumming hooves. Esther's mare, unused to gunfire, began to fight the bit, ears pinned, threatening to bolt sideways into a wash that would have broken a leg, and Alfred swung the bay in close, leaning across the gap between the 2 horses to catch the mare's headstall and speak to her in the same low, steady voice he used on every frightened animal he had ever gentled. And against all reason the mare settled enough to run straight rather than wild. They did not slow until Split Rock's chimney smoke showed against the darkening sky, and even then Alfred kept glancing back over his shoulder, certain Denny's men would not give up the chase for a stolen ledger that could hang them all. They reached the trading post as full dark fell, both horses lathered and blowing, and it was only once they were inside with the door barred that Esther allowed her hands to shake with the reaction she had held off through the whole desperate ride. "We have to get this ledger to Bragg's office," Alfred said, still catching his breath, "except we can't because Bragg's the very man it damns. We need the judge." "Cole isn't due for 2 more days," Esther said. "And Cutter will know by morning that his strongbox has been robbed and his ledger taken. He will not sit idle waiting for a judge to arrive and read it." "No," Alfred agreed grimly. "He won't." He was right, though neither of them yet understood how far Cutter was prepared to go, nor how soon. The following day passed in a strange, watchful quiet. Bragg came by the trading post once, ostensibly for tobacco, and studied Alfred with a narrow, calculating look that made the hair rise on the back of Esther's neck, though he said nothing of substance and left without incident. Riders passed through town more frequently than usual, men Esther did not recognize, buying supplies with unusual amounts of cash, and asking careless questions about the trading post's hours and the layout of the town. "They're scouting us," Alfred said that evening, watching from the post's window as yet another stranger rode out toward the north road. "Cutter knows we have the ledger. He's deciding how best to get it back before the judge arrives. Then we should ride for Sydney tonight and meet the judge on the road rather than wait here. With half of Cutter's gang watching every trail out of town, we wouldn't make 5 miles. Alfred rubbed a hand over his jaw, thinking, "No, I believe Cutter means to come here. This post sits square on the only road north worth using, now that the creek's too high to ford anywhere else this side of the hills. If he means to stop that gold shipment coming down from the Black Hills claims before the judge and whatever escort rides with it reaches Sydney, he needs control of Split Rock, if only for a day or 2. Taking this post, taking the ledger back, silencing us, all of that serves the same purpose for him. A gold shipment. Esther's eyes widened with understanding. That's why the robberies have grown bolder these last months. He's building towards something larger. I'd wager the whole operation, all of it, has been building toward exactly that, Alfred said. And I'd wager he means to do it soon, likely before the judge's escort thickens the road with more badges than he can buy off. They did not have long to wait to be proven right. It began at dawn 2 days later, not with gunfire but with silence, an unnatural stillness that fell over Split Rock as riders appeared on the ridges around the town in numbers too great to be anything but deliberate. More than a dozen men. Warren Cutter's whole operation converged in one place, cutting the roads in and out and closing slowly, methodically, toward the center of town. Bragg, when the alarm went up, did not organize any defense. He gathered what deputies remained loyal to him, which was to say none at all once the shooting began somewhere near the livery. And by the time the first shots cracked the morning quiet, the marshal himself had vanished from his office, and word spread through Split Rock like a grass fire that the men coming down off the ridge were not to be fought, only endured, and that every soul in town would do well to find shelter and stay there. It was fear more than any order that sent the men of Split Rock into hiding, but it was Bragg's example, and the whispered word passed house to house that resistance would only get a body killed, that turned that fear into flight. One by one, and then in a rush, the men of the town, farmers and shopkeepers and the smith and the preacher and every able-bodied soul who might otherwise have stood with a rifle in a doorway, retreated instead into the deep root cellar beneath the church, the largest and best-built shelter in town, and pulled the door shut behind them, leaving their wives, when their wives had nowhere else to go, to fend as best they could. Esther Whitaker did not go to the cellar. She stood instead in the doorway of her trading post as the first riders came down the main street at a walk, rifles resting easy across their saddle bows, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not quite courage and not quite fury but some hard alloy of both. Alfred had left before dawn, slipping out under cover of the last darkness on the fastest horse in the post's small string, carrying the ledger sewn into the lining of his coat, riding not for Sydney, but for the Lakota camp, gambling that standing Elks people, warned of what was coming and shown the ledger's proof of Cutter's crimes against travelers of every kind on the road they all depended upon, might ride to help. And gambling, too, that he could somehow reach word to Judge Cole's approaching party before Cutter's men closed every route in the county. It had been the hardest thing Esther had ever done, watching him ride out into the dark toward danger while she stayed behind to hold what she could, and neither of them had said aloud what they both understood, that either of them might not live to say what needed saying if this went badly. Now, with Cutter's men filling the street and every other soul in Split Rock huddled in a cellar praying to be forgotten, Esther Whitaker walked to the back room of her trading post, took down the shotgun her father had kept behind the counter for 30 years, and began, with hands that had stopped shaking sometime in the last hour, to load it. The first man to try the trading post door found it barred, and when he put his shoulder to it, Esther's voice came through the thick planks, flat and calm as still water. This post has stood on honest trade for 30 years, and it is not opening its doors to thieves. Step back from that door or I will put a load of shot through it at the height of a man's belly, and I do not much care which of you is standing there when I do. There was a pause, some muttering, and then the man's weight came off the door. Through a gun slot her father had cut into the shutter years ago, meant originally for defense against nothing more organized than the odd drunk or desperate traveler, Esther watched the street. She counted riders. She marked the ones who carried themselves like they had done violence before, and the ones who looked young and uncertain, boys really, swept up into Cutter's operation for wages they likely never saw the whole of. She noted, with a cold and useful clarity, that Jake Denny was not among them, which meant he was likely elsewhere, perhaps watching the northern approach for the very help Alfred had ridden to fetch. An old woman, the widow Hartley, came pounding on the post's rear door not 10 minutes later, having found nowhere else to go, and Esther let her in and set her to loading spare shells with hands that trembled but did not stop working. A boy named Petey, 12 years old, the stable handson, came scrambling over the back fence moments after, having been too slow to make the cellar with the rest, and Esther put him at the side window with strict instruction to watch and shout, not shoot, since the old percussion pistol he'd brought would do more harm to himself than to any outlaw. "Where's everybody else, Miss Whitaker?" Petey asked, wide-eyed, as another round of shouting rose from somewhere down the street where Cutter's men were breaking into the smithy for tools or weapons or simple spite. "Hiding," Esther said, and did not try to soften the word, because there was no kindness in pretending otherwise. "Every man old enough to hold a rifle in this town is sitting in the dark under the church right now, and I expect they will have a great deal of explaining to do to their wives and their own consciences once this is finished, if it is finished the way I mean for it to be." It was near midday when Warren Cutter himself rode up to the trading post, flanked by 4 riders, and called out for Esther to show herself, his voice carrying the easy, confident tone of a man who did not expect refusal. She stepped out onto the small porch with the shotgun cradled openly in her arms, close enough to be seen, far enough back that the doorway still offered some cover. "Mr. Cutter," she said, "I did not expect the freight company's regional agent to come calling with quite so large an escort. Miss Whitaker." Cutter was a lean, silver-templed man with a politician's smile that did not reach his eyes. "I believe you have something of mine. A ledger, taken from a lined shack that has nothing to do with me, though I hear it was found near enough to some of my company's business that folks might draw the wrong conclusions if it fell into careless hands." "I have a ledger," Esther agreed, "that records 2 years of robbery and murder on the road this whole territory depends upon, and payments made from that ledger to Marshal Bragg, and payments made into it from somewhere higher than you, Mr. Cutter, which I expect is the true reason you are so eager to have it back before Judge Cole arrives to read it for himself." Cutter's smile thinned. "You're a clever woman. I've heard that about you. Clever enough, I hope, to understand that I have 14 armed men in this street and you have a shotgun and a shop full of dry goods. Hand over the ledger, and whoever has run off with your horse thief lover along with it, and I will see this town suffers no further inconvenience." "He is not my lover," Esther said, though the words came out with less conviction than she intended, "and I do not have the ledger." "He does, and he is well beyond your reach by now, riding toward men who will make very sure Judge Cole and every marshal between here and Cheyenne learns exactly what is written in it." It was, in that moment, only half true, since she had no way of knowing whether Alfred had reached the Lakota camp safely, or whether he was even now lying dead on the prairie with Cutter's men closing on him. But she said it with the flat certainty of fact, because a lie told with conviction, she had learned across 6 years of trading, carried further than the truth told with doubt. Cutter studied her for a long moment, and something in his calculation shifted, the confidence in his face cracking just slightly at the edges. "Then we will simply have to wait here for him to come back, won't we? And in the meanwhile, I believe I'll be needing whatever supplies your post can offer my men, free of charge, as payment for the trouble you've caused me." "You will take nothing from this post," Esther said, and lifted the shotgun a fraction, "while I am still standing in this doorway." It might have ended badly there, with 14 armed men against 1 woman and a boy and an old widow, had Cutter been a man inclined toward reckless violence in the open street in front of witnesses. But he was, above all else, a careful man, one who had built a criminal enterprise on the appearance of respectability, and he was not yet ready to have it said, in a territory that already watched the road agents of the Black Hills Trail with growing outrage, that he had gunned down a woman in her own doorway. Instead, he settled his men into a siege, ringing the trading post and the town's main buildings, cutting off the well, watching every window, and waiting for Alfred Slater to either return with the ledger or be caught somewhere out on the prairie by the men he had sent to find him. The siege held through that day and into the night, Cutter's men making occasional testing rushes at the post's doors and windows that Esther and the widow Hartley and young Petey turned back with warning shots, and once, a genuine load of buckshot through a window frame that sent a man howling back to his horse with pellets in his shoulder. Through it all, the men of Split Rock stayed in their cellar beneath the church, and if any of them felt shame at leaving a woman, an old widow, and a boy to hold the town's only real fortification against 14 armed outlaws, none of them found the courage that night to open the cellar door and do differently. It was near dawn on the second day of the siege, with Esther's eyes burning from lack of sleep and her supply of shot running dangerously low, that she heard, faint but unmistakable across the stillness of the prairie morning, the sound of many horses coming hard from the north. For one terrible moment she feared it was more of Cutter's men, reinforcements come to finish what the siege had not. Then she heard, rising above the drumming hooves, a sound she knew as well as her own name, a long ululating cry carried on dozens of voices at once, and beneath it, closer, the particular rhythm of a horse she recognized, ridden by a man leaning low over its neck, driving it flat out toward the town. "Alfred," she breathed, and scrambled to the gun slot in time to see him come around the bend in the road at a dead run, the bay lathered white, and behind him, cresting the ridge in a wide sweeping line, more than 30 mounted Lakota riders understanding Elk's lead, rifles and bows in hand, bearing down on Cutter's positions with the terrible speed of men who had ridden through the night to arrive at exactly this hour. Cutter's men, who had settled into the comfortable posture of a siege against an unarmed town, were entirely unprepared for a mounted charge from the open prairie, and the effect was immediate and total. Shots rang out but scattered and panicked rather than organized, and within minutes Cutter's carefully assembled force was breaking apart, men scattering for their horses, abandoning positions, some throwing down weapons entirely rather than face riders who had every reason in the world, after years of broken treaties and stolen land, to show them no mercy at all. Esther burst from the trading post as Alfred swung down from his exhausted horse in the street, and she did not stop to think about propriety or what the remaining townsfolk peering out from cellar doors and shuttered windows might say, but crossed the distance between them and threw her arms around him hard enough to stagger them both. "You came back," she said into his shoulder, her voice breaking for the first time in 2 days of holding steady. "I thought I was afraid. I told you I'd come back." His arms closed around her, and she felt him shaking too, whether from the ride or from something else. "Standing Elk's whole camp rode the moment I showed them that ledger and told them what Cutter meant to do to this town, and to the road that feeds his people same as it feeds this one. He said no honest trader's daughter should stand alone against thieves while grown men hid in a cellar, and he was not about to let that stand if he could help it." Out in the street, Standing Elk's riders had rounded up most of Cutter's scattered men, disarming them at little cost of blood, beyond a few wounds and one broken arm from a man thrown clear of a bolting horse. Warren Cutter himself was found 20 minutes later, hiding in the smithy's coal shed, dragged out by 2 young Lakota riders who handled him with rough but careful hands, mindful, Esther understood later, of Standing Elk's instruction that the man be delivered alive to face whatever justice the judge would bring. It was into this scene, an hour after the fighting had ended, that Judge Emmett Cole's party finally arrived from the south, having been delayed a full day by high water at the ford, accompanied by 2 territorial marshals who had ridden with him on word, reaching Sydney days before, that trouble was brewing on the Black Hills Road. The cellar door beneath the church opened sometime around mid-morning, once word had spread that the danger had passed, and the men of Split Rock emerged blinking into the daylight, shame-faced and silent, to find their town secured not by their own hands, but by a woman with a shotgun, a widow, a 12-year-old boy, and 30 riders from a people many of them had spent years distrusting. Marshal Holly's brag was among the last to emerge, and Judge Cole, once the ledger had been placed in his hands, and its columns of payments and dates explained to him in Esther's clear, unwavering translation of Standing Elk's testimony alongside her own account of the siege, ordered him arrested on the spot, along with Warren Cutter, on charges that would eventually see both men stand trial in Sydney for conspiracy, robbery, and the murder of Tom Aldies, a crime the judge determined. Upon further questioning of Jake Denny, who was captured 2 days later trying to flee toward Wyoming territory, had been carried out by Denny's own hand at Cutter's direction, precisely as Standing Elk had. Witnessed from the bluff above Pumpkin Creek, Alfred Slater's name was cleared before the whole assembled town that same afternoon, Judge Cole reading the particulars aloud from the ledger, and from Esther's sworn account with a formality that finally, fully, lifted the shadow of the rope from Alfred's shoulders. Silas Prout, when confronted with the ledger's record of payments made to him for his false testimony, broke down within minutes and confirmed every detail of Bragg and Cutter's scheme, eager to trade his own confession for some measure of leniency. That evening, with the town's men still moving through the streets in a kind of chastened quiet, mending fences and clearing debris from the brief fighting with more energy than they had shown in 2 days of hiding, Esther found Alfred at the corral behind the stage relay station, gentling the bay horse that had carried him through the desperate ride to Standing Elk's camp and back again. "You could have been killed," she said, coming to lean against the corral fence beside him. "Riding out alone like that, with Cutter's men watching every road." "So could you," Alfred said, "standing in that doorway with nothing but a shotgun and a boy and an old woman between you and 14 armed men. I rode the whole way back expecting to find this post burned to the ground and you dead in the ashes, and I do not believe I have ever in my life been so afraid of anything as I was of that." "Then we are even in our foolishness," Esther said, "and perhaps we ought to stop taking such risks with each other's lives before one of us runs out of luck entirely." "I would agree to that," Alfred said, turning from the horse to face her fully, "except that I find myself unwilling to imagine a life that does not have you standing somewhere near the middle of it, risks and all." The words hung between them in the cooling evening air, plain and unguarded in a way neither of them had allowed themselves to be before, and Esther felt something in her chest loosen that had been drawn tight since the morning she had ridden into Split Rock with a stolen watch and a stranger's life in her hands. "I have spent 6 years telling every man in this territory that I have no interest in marrying anyone who wants my trading post more than he wants me," she said. "I do not intend to give up that post, Alfred Slater, not for you nor for any man, no matter how well he sits a horse or how many times he saves my life." "I would think a great deal less of you if you did," Alfred said. "I've no interest in a wife who sits idle behind a stove while there's a post to be run and a whole territory of folks, red and white both, who need an honest scale and an honest tongue between them. I'll train horses for the stage line same as I have, and there's talk they mean to make Split Rock a proper relay station now that the road's to be cleared of Cutter's kind for good. Seems to me a horse trainer and a trading post keeper might build a fine life together in a town that needs exactly what the both of us have to offer it, without either one of us needing to give up who we are to do it." Esther looked at him for a long moment, at the dust and exhaustion still on him from 2 days of riding and fighting for a town and a woman that had not, until very recently, been his to fight for, and she found that the careful, guarded calculation she had applied to every offer of marriage these past months simply would not come, because there was nothing here that needed weighing. There was only the plain, uncomplicated truth of a man who had ridden through danger to save her exactly as she had once ridden through danger to save him, and who wanted, at the end of it, nothing more than to stand beside her rather than in front of her or behind her. "Then I suppose," she said, and found she was smiling in a way she could not remember smiling in a very long time, "you had better ask me properly, Mr. Slater, instead of talking around it like a man discussing horseflesh." Alfred laughed, low and warm, and closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. The calluses of a man who worked with rope and rein, and the wildness of frightened animals, meeting the strength of a woman who had spent 6 years balancing scales and translating truths between worlds that did not always wish to understand one another. "Esther Whitaker," he said, "I have known you the better part of a year across a trading post counter and the better part of a week through a hanging, a chase, and a siege, and I have never in my life met anyone I would rather stand beside for whatever comes next. Will you marry me, and let me spend the rest of my days making sure you never have to face a rope, a robbery, or a siege alone again?" "I will," Esther said, "on the condition that you understand I intend to keep right on running my post and translating for whoever needs an honest voice between them, sea or no siege, and that you will not spend our marriage trying to keep me tucked away safe in some cellar while the world happens without me." "I would not dream of it," Alfred said. "I married the woman who held this town together while every other soul in it hid underground. I would be a fool to ask her to be anything less than exactly who she is." They were married 3 weeks later, on a clear October morning with the prairie grass gone the color of wheat bread and the first cold edge of autumn in the wind, in a ceremony held in front of the trading post rather than the church, at Esther's insistence, since it was the trading post, she said, that had made her who she was, and it seemed fitting that her marriage should begin on its porch. Standing Elk and a dozen members of his band attended as honored guests, an unprecedented thing for Split Rock, and though a few of the old prejudices lingered in some faces in the crowd, most of the town, chastened still by 2 days spent hiding in a cellar while a woman held their homes together, offered nothing but welcome. Judge Cole delayed a further week in the territory to see Cutter and Bragg properly bound over for trial, stood as witness to the marriage before continuing his circuit, remarking privately to Alfred that he had presided over a great many hangings and a great many weddings in his years riding this territory, and that he could not recall another occasion where the same rope that nearly ended one had led, by so strange and winding a road, directly to the other. Warren Cutter and Hollis Bragg were convicted the following spring in Sydney, their testimony against one another, each eager to shift the greater blame elsewhere, doing more to seal their own fates than any evidence the prosecution could have gathered alone. Jake Denny, captured near the Wyoming line, was tried separately for the murder of Tom Aldis and sentenced to hang, a sentence carried out with none of the haste or injustice that had nearly claimed Alfred's life, but only after a full and proper trial, with evidence weighed and witnesses heard, and translated with the same careful honesty Esther had brought to every transaction of her working life. The Sydney to Deadwood Road in the months that followed grew safer than it had been in years, the worst of the road agents scattered or arrested, and freight and gold alike began moving through Split Rock Station with a regularity that brought new prosperity to the little town that had once nearly hanged an innocent man rather than wait for the truth. Split Rock itself changed in other ways too, in the year that followed. The stage company, true to Alfred's word, made the town an official relay station, and Alfred built a fine set of corrals and a breaking pen behind the trading post where he trained horses for the line, and for any rancher or farmer within a day's ride who had an animal too wild or too frightened for their own hands to manage, his reputation for patience with terrified creatures growing until men rode 2 days out of their way just to have him gentle a horse no one else would touch. Esther kept the trading post exactly as her father had built it, honest scales and honest words for every soul who walked through its door, red or white, rich or poor, and her translations, sought now not only by traders, but by the territorial government itself. Whenever treaty business or trade disputes required a voice both sides could trust, carried her reputation far beyond the borders of the little town on the Black Hills Road. On quiet evenings, when the day's trading was done and the horses were settled for the night, Esther would often find Alfred waiting for her on the porch of the post they now shared as their home, and she would sit beside him and watch the prairie sun go down gold and red over land that had nearly cost them both everything, and think that she had never in her life imagined a happiness quite like this one, built not on a man rescuing her from her own life, nor on her rescuing him from his, but on the two of them standing together, each fully themselves, against whatever the wide and unpredictable territory saw fit to send their way. "Any regrets, Mrs. Slater?" Alfred asked her one such evening, nearly a year to the day since she had ridden into town with a stolen watch and a stranger's life balanced on the truth she carried. Esther considered the question seriously, as she considered most things, weighing it the way she weighed every measure of goods across her counter. "Only that I did not ride faster," she said finally, "and nearly let a good man hang before I understood what he might come to mean to me." "You made it in time," Alfred said, drawing her hand into his. "That's all that ever needed to happen." And out on the prairie, the last light faded slow and gentle over the road that no longer belonged to thieves, past the trading post that had never once, through siege or storm or the long, slow work of ordinary days, stopped keeping its scales honest, and its doors open to whoever needed them, and the two of them sat together in the settling dark, entirely and quietly at peace.